Have you guys seen that Frank Miller's getting a movie? And I don't mean Zack Snyder's adapting another one of his books into a feature-length film. I mean an actual movie, named after him, about him, and Frank Miller's still alive, to see this movie come to fruition. Now, I just rewatched the trailer, and these trailers always get to me. I know that some people don't necessarily like the very professional, very almost highly edited, very scripted kinds of trailers where you have these guys, oh, well, this person, he was quite the genius he was in his time, and he did this, and they're chopping up 5 different people saying 5 different things, and they turn it into one sentence. And I know that some people aren't a big fan of that. I eat those up. And I really enjoy those because between the music and the montage, it really makes me feel an emotion that says, I'm really buying what you're selling. And I think for somebody like Frank Miller, who made his name in comic books, not through some other medium, he did a comic book. It was called The Dark Knight Returns. You guys might know about it. He did that book, and it blew up. Not only did it blow up, but it subverted your expectations of what Batman was supposed to be. Now, I take it most of you guys weren't around during that time. If you guys are any close to my age, I remember when it was coming out. I remember when I first read it. I remember when I first saw the iconography of it. There's the guy who directed the Dune movies, Dennis something. His last name starts with a V. You guys know who I'm talking about. He's a French director, I believe. He came out with a statement, and he said, movies... dialogue slows down movies, and I don't remember any dialogue from movies. The most memorable parts are the sounds and the striking images. Now, it's real easy for a guy who did most of his movie in CGI to say that powerful images are the way to go for a movie, but what's struck me about what he was saying was, well, this sounds like you'd really appreciate these things called comic books, because you don't often remember language in comic books unless the dialogue is very well written. What you do remember, and what pertains to Frank Miller, is the very powerful image. Because if there's any guy in comic books, any artist, any writer that can strike a powerful image, how about it's the guy who made Batman's silhouette in front of a lightning strike? How about we call that guy about powerful images? Now, the other part about Frank Miller, and I'm sure they'll cover it in the movie in depth, is he's a very controversial guy in the realm of comic books and storytelling, because you have his hits like The Dark Knight Returns, like 300, like Daredevil, Man Without Fear. You have those hits, and then you have the rest. And the rest is where it gets really interesting, because as a longtime fan of Frank Miller, especially his work on Batman, I've read much of his more controversial work, and I see the controversy in it. Whether it be Batman the Boy Wonder that he did with Jim Lee, All-Star Batman, whether it's The Dark Knight Master Race, which I have sitting right here by my foot, I see the controversy in those books, and I myself take problem with those books, but as I get older, as I become a better artist myself, I go back, I reread those books, and I like them even more. I saw cartoonist Kayfabe talk about All-Star Batman and Robin, and I don't know if it was Pisco or Rugg that was saying, well, this is every Batman critic's big dream, is they can point to this book and say, this is everything wrong with Batman, and this proves my point, because this is Batman illustrated by Jim Lee and written by Frank Miller. And I think all the parts in that make Batman look like some over-the-top, unhinged maniac, I'm eating that up. I remember reading it, and I think, this is terrible. I love it. And I don't mean it's so bad it's good. I mean it's so good because it's bad. And when you have a writer, there's a very particular kind of writer that can write something like that. And Frank Miller's that guy. It takes a lot of skill, because most writers would have just bombed. They would have had a mediocre story. They would have had nothing memorable about the story. But notice how you're talking about it. That's the difference. Is when one writer flops a story, you don't talk about it. Oh, it wasn't any good, and you forget about it. But we're still talking about All-Star Batman and Robin. We're talking about it whether you hate it or whether you like it, but that's good. What did I say in the last video? The importance of these stories is that they're repeated, that they're talked about, that they're ingrained into the mythology. Stories change over time. If you look at any kind of mythology, which Frank Miller is familiar with, as is Alan Moore, the stories change over time. There is no one story of myth. There is no one story of Zeus, of the Babylonian gods, the Mesopotamian gods. There's no one story of them. There is a generalization of, oh, well, this generally happens and this guy usually acts like this, but there's not a whole lot else to that unless you want to cite a particular story from a particular time from a certain translator who translated it this way as opposed to this guy who did it that way. There's not even one Bible that people can agree on in a relative space a whole lot of times. So when you look at a guy like Frank Miller taking on a character of Batman who was never real, he was just a made-up character in comic books, well, you could do a whole lot with that. And you hear Frank Miller talk about these characters. And what am I getting at? Because I am distracting myself just a little bit here. But one of the things that makes Frank Miller able to get away with these things that, oh, well, he can't do more than one series. He's really good at making a really good hit. He can't continue the series. He has Batman Year One. That was a great thing. He couldn't go much further past that. And I am inclined to agree. But as I said before, I eat that up. The question is why? Why is Frank Miller able to get away with these other guys aren't? Well, first of all, he established himself on the scene. You see what Neil Adams did at the tail end of his career, and it was pretty crazy. It wasn't the greatest artwork, it wasn't the greatest stories, but it was interesting. And that's the word that I wanted to bring up, is interesting. Because one of the fundamental parts, especially in this era that we have of commercialism, to be an artist is to be interesting. That's kind of rule number one. Is you could have really cool looking artwork, but if it's not interesting, if it's not telling me a cool story, if it's not a good idea, well, I'm just going to brush it over. If you can't sell me a story of you, the illustrator, or even this individual piece, that it's not really that interesting. And so I'm not going to buy it. And that's very important, because Frank Miller, on the other hand, you look at the guy, and unfortunately he has these health problems, but he has this sort of creak in his neck. He always has that fedora on. He's always wearing black. He's an interesting look. He is, in himself, a character. How many people do you get like that? We can talk about Frank Miller, the man, as much as we can talk about Frank Miller's stories. And what more do you want from a writer than a writer that you can talk about as much as his stories? And so when you have this guy comes onto the scene, I'm listening to him talk in this trailer. I just rewatched it, and he's talking about striking these powerful images, the ink, the brush, and he said, I was trying to see how much I could get out of line until I stopped using the line at all. And you look at some of his work from more recent times, and you get these very bold, you can see the individual brushstrokes. He's making so many mistakes across his canvas, but then you get this very, very gritty, almost ugly looking Batman staring you in the face, and you can't help but feel something in reaction to it. And you can't get that from a lot of guys. They can't draw you the Batman. Let me take Jason Fabok for example. He has some of the boldest, strongest looking figures, Greek statues of figures that you can get with his Batman, with his Superman, with his Wonder Woman. But one thing I have noticed about Fabok's style is they're interchangeable. Batman looks like Superman. Superman looks like Batman, looks like Green Lantern. They all have the same body. And you might think, well, of course they do. They're all buff superheroes, don't they? No, they don't. Because it's not so much about the exact precision of the body. It's not so much about illustrating an anatomically exaggerated figure. Sometimes it's about illustrating Superman. And what do I mean by that? I mean, Superman isn't so much an Adonis statue as he is an idea. That's why when you go back and you look at some of the original Superman, they weren't built the way that Jim Lee drew it, for instance, in 2003 or 2005 or 1995. Superman's changed over the years, as has Batman, as has Green Lantern. And why do they change? What separates these things? And why is this important to the topic of Frank Miller? And I'll get to that, wrap it up here. It's important because if you're able to illustrate the idea of a character, more so than a proper illustration of human anatomy. Listen, if you want to do that, go be Leonardo da Vinci. Go study the proportions. Go make these calculations. But don't put it in my superhero comic books. Use that information to make better superhero comics by exaggerating and by getting better at telling me the idea. That's the thing, is that there are artists that can give you the human body, but they can't give you Batman. They can give you a drawing of Batman, but that's not Batman. Frank Miller, And the reason that he's getting this movie, and the reason that he's such a controversial figure, everybody has these opinions on, and I love that whenever people have all these opinions, because they're always so strong, and they believe them, and I love that. Because that means that the writer in question, the person in question, whoever's making people feel all these things, that means one thing. And that is that they're interesting. And that's the most important thing as a storyteller, as an artist, that you can be. So, as far as Frank Miller getting this movie, I'm excited for it. I'm going to see if I'm going to check it out tomorrow. If I do, I'll definitely tell you guys about it. But until then, be interesting.